Well, we're still waiting for parts to put the permanent door in here, but we can't wait any longer. We are going to start flooring. And I always recommend you read the manufacturer's instructions, but we're putting in a engineered hardwood, so very dimensionally stable, but you still have to pay attention to acclimatizing your flooring to where you're installing it. You want to have equilibrium moisture content. So you want this to acclimatize. Pay attention to manufacturers. Some manufacturers will say 48 hours. Some manufacturers will say till it reaches its ECM. And there are moisture meters you can use to test that. You also want to make sure that your subfloor is really good and dry. Now, we've had a roof on this place for quite a while. Dehumidifier has run during the painting and priming process, or priming and painting process. There is very little. I could put a moisture meter on this, but I know that that subfloor is well below 12%. And because the flooring's been here long enough, I know that it is well below 12%. Here we are. We always have a few of these kicking around. And as you can see, we're 18 degrees Celsius, so we're 68, 65, 68, somewhere in there, and 43% relative humidity. So, well within the specs. Whenever possible, we tell our clients that, you want to have the humidity levels in your house like at 50%, maintain 50%. And installing an ERV is going to be helpful in that process, because to a certain extent, especially in the wintertime, it can help maintain that humidity level. Is it perfect? No. If we have some really foggy summers, are they going to need whole house dehumidification? Maybe. The heat pump will be able to offer some dehumidification to a certain extent, but is it going to be enough? The coils are more efficient, so they don't stay cold long enough to do that dehumidification. And you might be going, okay, like, Aaron, where are you going with this? Why are you talking about humidity and dehumidification and humidification? Well, it's the floor. So even though we know this is engineered and it is dimensionally stable, if we install it where it is, under 12%, we know that the floor is under 12%, and we install this at roughly 18 degrees C, a little less than 50% relative humidity, it is going to be just fine as long as we maintain, a certain amount of humidity in the house, somewhere in the neighborhood of that, probably, 35 plus, probably closer to 40, up to, 55. But if we raise the humidity in the house, or if the owner raises the humidity in the house into the 80s range, 80, 90% relative humidity on a regular basis, not just like a one-off event, like you've got the window open for one day, but multiple days of high humidity, the floor is going to take on moisture, and we could have some issues that way. And the same can be said for multiple days of extremely low relative humidity. These windows back here, for example, spinning around. In the wintertime, when it is already, relatively dry outside and the sun is low in the sky and beaming in here, without proper shading and without some proper controls, the temperature over there is going to very, very quickly read, 30 degrees plus. In fact, I already know that the cooling load for this house is going to be greater than the heating load. Everybody loves windows that face the water. So, again, lots of heat, low relative humidity. The ERV is not going to be able to bring in enough fresh air to maintain 50%. So we know that that's going to drop off. So without maintaining temperature or maybe adding a little bit of humidity, it is possible that we could see over the course of a winter, over the course of a month, the floor actually dry out a little bit and, open up a tiny little bit. Again, it's not going to be anywhere near as, I'm going to say risk. I'm going to say the amount that it's going to move is nowhere near the same amount that traditional hardwood, natural hardwood would move. But engineered hardwood, even though it's dimensionally stable, it still can move around a little bit. So stuff to think about. Your finishes, they are affected by the relative humidity. They're affected by the temperature. So when you're planning your house, when you're planning your renovation, little things to put in the back of your head that may affect how you build or how you should build. All right, back to flooring. Enough about humidity and temperature. So you can see that I have a line snapped here, and you can see my mark here off the wall. And I have a very similar mark way down at the other end. And how I've determined where to make that mark and snap that line is I've taken the full width of my board and I've added the thickness. So this is just shy of 1/2 inch. So I'm using 1/2 inch. It's, a little better than 7/16, but not quite a full 1/2 inch. So I'm just rounded up to a 1/2 inch. So that dimension there, off the wall, that gives me room for a 1/2 inch of expansion the entire way around. And that's what I'm going to maintain. I'm going to maintain 1/2 inch off the wall, 1/2 inch off the wall at the end, and a 1/2 inch off the wall behind me as well. So this is, obviously read the manufacturer's instructions, but a good rule of thumb is whatever the thickness of the flooring is, that is the gap off of any wall, whether it's on your long run or at the end. That's the gap that you want to maintain. So for example, if that was 3/4, I would have a 3/4 inch gap. If it was 1/4 inch, I would have a 1/4 inch gap. A little room for expansion. Got a little bit of a mock-up happening here. If you've been following along, you know that we have our pan for the window that sits down. And way back when, I mentioned that we would trim it flush with the floor. This is kind of just to get a few pictures and get a look of it. And ideally, we would have a 1/2 inch gap for expansion. That's a little bit much for right in the window. So I've cheated a little bit, but what I've done is I've cut, when I ripped this flooring to fit, I ripped it on a steep bevel. So if we do get some serious expansion, that top layer of the floor is not going to be as strong as the entire thickness, and hopefully we won't have any expansion issues. If we do, well, we do, and I'll have to come back and fix it, but I highly doubt we will. Very dimensionally stable. I'm going to also glue down this area for a couple reasons. Going to have a lot of natural light here, so we don't want a bunch of essentially brad nail holes or pinholes in this area. So we'll glue it down. We'll have to wait for it to set up to move forward, but sometimes it's worth going the extra mile just to have a better look in the end. As you can see, flooring is well underway. And one of the things I appreciate about Advantech X-Factor is I don't have to sand any of my edges. I haven't had to bust out the belt sander for any of these seams. And if you've worked with traditional OSB or traditional plywood, if that subfloor sees any amount of weather during the phase of during construction phases, quite often there's a few seams somewhere in the building that require a bit of sanding. The only thing that I do have to do is occasionally, where we've got some tape seams that are a bit of an issue, is I have got to get underneath that and just ensure that all this dirt comes out. Now, this is also probably an example of how tenacious zip tape sticks over time. You can get it off, but it's coming off in pieces. I just want to remove that extra layer. Probably wouldn't affect flooring, but it makes sense to do it. Now, if you didn't have to protect the floor below, or you weren't worried about minimizing the water load, the amount of water that was going to get into your building during construction, maybe you wouldn't have to tape these seams. But for us, taping the seams makes sense during construction because, one, it eliminates a lot of the bulk water that ends up in our building, in our basement. Two, it gives us a dry place to work and store materials on rain day. And if you've ever worked in heavy rain, usually production goes down. So if we can make a productive environment where we can still essentially work, doesn't matter what the weather is, we try to. And a couple of rolls of tape on top of the X-Factor goes a long ways. Plus, it reduces the callbacks. What I mean by that is that moisture load in your building that is constantly coming out of whether it's concrete or your other building materials is reduced. So you can dry your building out a lot faster. I forget where I picked this block up, but it was for laminate flooring. It might have even been pergo flooring. But there's just a slight bevel to that block. I've also taken other nylon blocks and I've done that. So essentially when it hooks on that top layer, when I beat on it, I'm not actually beating on the finish. I'm actually beating down below it. And you need something that is going to be able to apply pressure to get your pieces to fit together and not damage or splinter that top. It's an important step. Nobody makes floors that are open or not tight together, but if you put down any amount of flooring, whether it's natural hardwood, engineered hardwood, you know that sometimes you have to finesse a piece together. Every manufacturer is different. This particular flooring requires a narrow crown staple every 6 to 8 inches. At least that's what it says in the instructions. Quite often we install flooring that will have a medium crown staple. We also install flooring that requires a cleat nail, or flooring that requires either or. I've had this little tapping block forever. I've used it for laminate flooring. Obviously we're using it on engineered flooring here today. Needs something to effectively tap it into place without damaging it. Much faster for getting our floor in place. I do have some PL underneath this. And it sets up pretty fast, but a couple pins, there's cabinetry going in here. Goes a long ways just to hold this. I can move on and keep going. I'm adding a little PL premium where I can't effectively staple the flooring. There's going to be cabinets along here. Use my Viking Arm, squeeze it into place. I'm going to have to come back and get a little tap here, but a couple of brad nails that holds that end down with the glue. I can staple this off, and again, Viking Arm making life really easy. If I was smart, I would have had that closer, but I've been a little bit of up and down and planning here lately, but a few brad nails, and that is taken care of.